Welcome to Chapter 2 lecture, Nature, Nurture, and Neurodiversity. Now, if we explore the question, what makes you you, we're going to fall back on the concepts of nature and nurture for guidance. In nature are innate biological or genetically determined factors. They're your DNA or your personal blueprint that makes you unique. And we look at nurture, which is your environment, your lived experiences, and what you've learned over the years. For centuries, researchers have explored whether nature or whether nurture are responsible for why people are the way they are. And this has produced some extreme viewpoints called nativism and environmentalism. Nativists would argue development is fully controlled either by genes or by innate knowledge and abilities, sometimes called instincts. And environmentalists would argue humans are essentially born as blank slates, and personalities and behaviors develop in response to one's environment. Now, it's important to understand that over the years we've grown to learn that genes shape psychological development, and our environment shapes our genes. So, psychologists have now taken an interactionist perspective because we know that both our genes and our environment play a role in shaping human beings. So they're working together, and it's not a debate anymore as to whether nature or whether nurture are responsible. It's how much each are responsible for how people are the way they are. Twin studies have been used to study the role and impact that nature and nurture have on human development. And researchers look at similarities and differences between monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins reared together and reared apart. And they're looking at the similarities and differences of a wide variety of things, such as personality, political viewpoints, preferences, appearance, habits, and so on. And what's interesting is when you look at monozygotic twins reared apart, we see very similar individuals in political viewpoints, appearance, the way they talk, cadence, all sorts of things are maintaining. So it's not just their environment. Genes do have a strong hold on making you. Now, exploring nature and nurture through the lens of the 7 different perspectives of psychology, you will find that some perspectives in psychology lean more towards nature, and other perspectives lean more towards nurture. But again, contemporary psychologists strongly believe that both nature and both nurture play a role in shaping a human being. So they both play a role in human development. And again, it's not whether one is responsible and the other's not. It's how much of nature is responsible and how much of nurture is responsible for human development. In review of the 7 perspectives in psychology, we'll look at what each perspective focuses, basically. So to begin neuroscience, we're focusing on biological influences on human behavior, such as hormones, right? By studying the body and the brain, including brain chemistry. So you're looking at how the body and mind are communicating at more of like a chemical level. Evolutionary perspective focuses on natural selection or survival of the fittest as it relates to reproduction and genes. So those who are fit and healthy and don't have mutations, right, they'll live, they'll be able to reproduce and multiply and go on. And evolutionary perspective would say that natural selection weans away weak genes from our environment. So those with weak genes don't survive or reproduce. Behavior genetics perspective looks at how genes and the environment interact and work together to influence our traits and behaviors, so the role of both. In cognitive perspective, focuses on how we encode, process, and store information in the mind. So a lot of the way we interpret information is how we perceive it, and through our senses, right? Feeling, which is touch, taste, smell, hearing, and vision. So cognitive psychologists explore those senses and how we process information in our minds. The psychodynamic perspective studies how behavior might be caused by repressing or resolving unconscious drives and desires. We think back to Chapter 1 lecture. Remember the name Sigmund Freud. He was the leader in this area in believing that much of who we are is the result of our unconscious conflicts and why we behave the way we do. The behavioral perspective focuses on how we learn through observable behavior, and it studies how behavior is nurtured by the environment through forming associations, modeling how to act, or responding with punishments or rewards. And the social cultural perspective has a focus on behavior and thinking and how those vary across situations and cultures. Now, our mind and body communicate all the time. And in order to understand how the mind and body interact, you first have to understand the nervous system. And the nervous system is quite complex. It interacts with the endocrine system to secrete hormones that regulate and control virtually everything in your body, such as metabolism, physical growth, blood pressure, and sexual arousal. At the cellular level, your brain and body communicate through what are known as neurons. And neurons are central to everything that you do, from moving your muscles to recalling memories and even experiencing emotions. Your brain and body have billions of neurons. And the connections between your neurons does matter. So the stronger connections are the ones that are most repetitive or most frequently engaged in. So neurons that have strong connections typically stay healthy in the human body, and neurons that have weaker connections typically will die off over time when they're not being activated. And that's a process known as pruning. So your body has a way of recycling and reabsorbing unused neurons, and you always have an ability to generate new neurons. Like say you learn a new task, you're developing new neural connections in your brain as you learn new information and new tasks. Now I want to go over this image here, which is the anatomy of a neuron. And Information travels between neurons through electrical impulses. All right, and they enter your neuron through a dendrite. This is the area here. And it travels through the cell body and down an axon. And the axon is just this long purple extension that's carrying the message to other neurons. And the myelin sheath is responsible for that message to be carried efficiently and quickly down the axon. It's coated in this fatty coating that serves as an insulation or an insulator to the axon, ensuring that that message is getting sent very quickly down the axon. And once it gets down the axon, it gets to these synaptic terminals, or they're often referred to as terminal buttons. So at the synaptic terminals, we have information that gets sent to muscles, glands, and other neurons. So information is now leaving, the messages are now leaving your neuron. Now I showed this image here because it's a great visual of the synapse, or the synaptic cleft. And here we have our terminal, synaptic terminals, or terminal buttons, and information in the form of chemicals known as neurotransmitters are leaving one neuron and trying to enter another neuron down here through their dendrite. And we see the neurotransmitters, and they're trying to bind to the appropriate receptor site in order to enter. So a lot is going on at the synaptic cleft, the space between one neuron, which is the terminal button or the synaptic terminal, and a new dendrite. The lock and key model of receptor signal interaction is important to understand as you look into that synaptic cleft, try to understand what's going on. So you have to understand that each type of neurotransmitter has a distinctive configuration that allows it to fit into a specific type of receptor cell. So receptor cells don't allow just any neurotransmitter to go through it. They have to have that distinctive configuration, like a lock and a key. Now sometimes there's what are known as imposters. And imposters are like having a fake key that fits into the lock, but it doesn't open it. All right? Antagonist drugs are a great example of this. So if someone's overdosed on opioids, naloxone, which is an antagonist drug, would be released into their body, and it binds to the receptor and blocks, reverses the effects and blocks additional opioids from entering those receptors. It's important to go over this table so you're familiar with some neurotransmitters that'll be talked about quite frequently as not only in this course, but in additional psychology courses should you move and advance within this major. So acetylcholine is involved in muscle movements as well as sensory and memory processing, and too little of acetylcholine is related to paralysis and amnesia. It's associated with Alzheimer's disease as well. Too much can produce muscle cramping. Dopamine, which you're all familiar with, is involved with pleasure and reward. It's related to motivation, desire, and voluntary movement. So when you have too little dopamine, you're going to have symptoms of related to Parkinson's disease due to loss of motor function. And if you have too much dopamine, you might have hallucinations, which are symptomatic of schizophrenia. Norepinephrine produces a state of alertness and arousal, and it's related to the hormone epinephrine, which is adrenaline, which produces a sudden burst of energy when released into the blood. Too little is linked to depression and difficulty with focusing, and too much norepinephrine is linked to anxiety and the negative effects of chronic stress. Glutamate increases activity in the central nervous system, speeds up neural communication, and strengthens communication among synapses. Too little is linked to difficulty with focusing or concentrating, and too much can lead to cellular damage or death. Then we have GABA, which is gamma-aminobutyric acid, and this decreases activity in the central nervous system and produces a feeling of calm. Too little GABA is linked to difficulty settling down and plays a role in insomnia, anxiety, and epilepsy. Too much produces a sedative effect. And serotonin. Serotonin helps regulate mood, hunger, sleep, and desire. And too little is linked to irritable mood, fatigue, and decreased appetite. And too much affects digestion and increases your heart rate. Your course web text does a great job sharing neurotransmitters in action by way of an example of commuting to work, by way of driving your own car. So in this example, you're leaving your house, you're saying goodbye to loved ones and to your pets, and those feel-good chemicals, neurotransmitters, dopamine and serotonin, are being released at that time. And they're still with you as you're on your way to work, but then you hit, heavy traffic, or there's an accident up in front that slows down traffic. And they describe norepinephrine and glutamate being released into your body so that you're paying close attention and you're being alert on the road. And I would add to this example, maybe you picked up breakfast on your way to work or you brought it with you. That would release dopamine and serotonin as well. So you're constantly maybe going back and forth between hyperstate of arousal and happy feelings, happy chemicals going through your bloodstream. They then say you park your car, you get to work, you park your car, and first thing you do is you open Facebook, or you're scrolling through your phone and you're looking through posts. And that's releasing dopamine. But it can also trigger norepinephrine should you come across a post that you're not happy with. It's kind of making you upset a little bit. And then it goes on to say, well, then it's like 3 minutes before you're supposed to start work, so you finally realize and you remember time to go into work. So acetylcholine, norepinephrine, and glutamate all kick in to get you into work on time. So what a great example to show neurotransmitters in action. And I hope that helps you as you try to learn these neurotransmitters and their functions. Your nervous system is composed of the central and peripheral nervous systems. And the central nervous system is composed of your brain and spinal cord, as outlined in this turquoise portion of the image. Let's begin by exploring the anatomy of the human brain, and we'll begin with the hindbrain, or the lowest level of the brain. This area of the brain controls the most basic survival functions, and it operates automatically outside of conscious effort. It consists of the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. Your medulla controls your breathing and your heart rate, and also vital muscle movements such as coughing and swallowing. The pons sits on top of the medulla, and it regulates sleep and alertness. And your cerebellum, or your little brain, controls balance and coordination, as well as learning and memory functions. The midbrain is an important area of the brain that helps to regulate attention and alertness. And that's important to know because the pons, which is right below it, is also involved in alertness, as well as the regulation of sleep. So in this area of the brain, it controls involuntary reflexes that take place in response to visual and auditory stimuli. So for example, the dilation and shrinking of your pupils in response to light is controlled in the midbrain. And in this area of the brain, you have what is known as the reticular activating system, or the RAS. And this filters out unnecessary raw sensory data so that only important information is sent to be processed. This keeps us from being overwhelmed by the sheer amount of sensory information our body takes in at any given moment. It's also important to know that dopamine, that feel-good neurotransmitter, is released here in the midbrain. And that depletion of dopamine, or cell death in this region that depletes dopamine, is related to Parkinson's disease. The forebrain is a pretty large area of the brain, and it consists of the cerebral cortex as well as the subcortex. And the forebrain is responsible for us to have the ability to process emotions, form memories, engage in complex thoughts, and engage in motivations. The subcortex lies right under the cerebral cortex, and this is an area known as the animal brain, or your limbic system. Now let's start off by reviewing the parts of the limbic system, and we'll begin with the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is about the size of a peanut, sitting in the middle of your head. And it receives messages from the hypothalamus that stimulate it to release growth hormones that aid in the development of bones, cartilage, and muscle. And the pituitary gland is also very important because this small gland controls a wide variety of other glands within your endocrine system. The hippocampus is primarily responsible for the creation of new neural connections every time memories are formed. So it's responsible for memory, and it helps you to remember places and objects within space. So every time you get up, you walk into your living room, you have a memory of the location of the furniture within that room. And that's because of your hippocampus. The thalamus, as seen here, is in the center of the limbic system. And it receives filtered out sensory information from the midbrain, and then tells that information as to where to go within your cortex. So when I think of the thalamus, I think of the air traffic control center of the brain and the way that it directs information into the cortex. And when we're sleeping, there's still a lot of stimulation in our environment that's around us. And one of the unique functions of the thalamus is to basically block out all of that stimulation, aside from smell, because smell is processed in the cortex. It blocks out all the stimulation so that you are able to get rest at night. The hypothalamus, seen here, is located directly beneath the thalamus, and it's responsible for regulating blood pressure, body temperature, glucose levels, sleep cycles, sexual arousal, as well as hunger. And its main job is to maintain a state of balance in the body known as homeostasis. It's also a contributor to our endocrine system and how it helps to regulate and maintain hormone levels in the body. Now the amygdala, as seen here, are two almond-like shapes that are in the center of the brain, responsible for your experience of emotion. They're located in both cerebral hemispheres, and it helps you make associations with those emotions in order to survive. So, for example, you might develop a fear of snakes. So just seeing visually a snake appear, you then have a fear that develops to help you not get hurt or injured by that snake. Now, you've heard me just mention cerebral hemispheres. Everyone has a left and a right cerebral hemisphere, or a left brain and a right brain. What's connecting both sides of the brain is a structure known as the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum would look something like this on an imaging scan, or here on the anatomy of the brain. And it's a very thick rubbery tissue connecting both hemispheres of the brain. Now, when people process information, let's take vision for example, what you see in your left eye gets processed into your right hemisphere. And what you see with your right eyeball gets processed in your left hemisphere. So this corpus callosum connecting both sides of the brain is incredibly important in order to function. When people suffer from severe forms of epilepsy, doctors might do a procedure where they cut into the corpus callosum and split the brain. And when doing so, the seizures typically will stop. Both the left and right hemispheres can further be divided into 4 lobes of the brain, and each is responsible for different functions. So if we start here at the back of the brain, your occipital lobe, this area is responsible for processing visual information. So everything you see gets processed in the back of your head. Above that, you have a parietal lobe. In your parietal lobe, it's responsible for you experiencing sensations such as touch, temperature, and pressure. And there's a band right before you meet the frontal lobe, a band right here, known as the somatosensory cortex. And this cortex is responsible for you processing all sensory stimulation outside of auditory stimulation. The temporal lobe, located right next to the ear, is where you process that auditory information. And the frontal lobe, right behind the forehead, is where you make decisions. So that's the decision-making center of the brain. Within your frontal lobe, you will have, towards the back here, right next to the somatosensory cortex, you have what is known as the motor cortex. And the motor cortex sends signals down your brainstem into your spinal cord, telling you what body part to move. The peripheral nervous system is everything else outside of your brain and spinal cord. What I like about this diagram that I'm sharing with you is that it shows how your peripheral nervous system is further divided. And we're going to begin by exploring the somatic division and autonomic divisions of your peripheral nervous system. So the somatic division of your peripheral nervous system controls movements of your body. It relays information from your central nervous system to your muscles and to your sensory organs in order to do so. So if we want to explore how a movement is made in the body, well, your brain will first send a signal to your body to move that muscle. And that signal is sent from the brain to the spinal cord to the somatic division of your peripheral nervous system. And in this area, neurotransmitters get released that activate the muscles and joints to move. Then information from the somatic division is sent back to the brain that share with the brain how the muscle is doing and how it's feeling. So it's a big loop of communication between the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system every time your body engages in movement. The autonomic nervous system regulates physiological changes that occur in the body, such as your heart rate increasing or decreasing, and the stimulation of glands to release hormones throughout the body, all of which are done automatically outside of one's control. And it's divided into the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. And I like to, when I discuss these things with students, I like to use the example of fight or flight response and in the activation of the autonomic nervous system. So let's say you're walking home from school and out of nowhere a bear jumps out of the woods and starts following you. Well, your sympathetic nervous system would rev into gear. All right, this is flight mode. And your pupils might dilate. You're going to stop salivating. You're going to stop being hungry. You're not going to have to go to the bathroom. Your heart's going to accelerate. You're going to breathe heavier and faster. And you're going to have to get the heck out of there. Now, you stand still and you wave your arms and you frighten the bear to go away. And over the next 10 minutes, your body starts calming down. So your parasympathetic nervous system kicks into gear, making your body go back to baseline. It slows your heart rate. Your digestive system is working now. Your bladder's probably full and you probably have to really go to the bathroom after being so frightened. But your whole body is going back to rest mode. So your sympathetic nervous system kind of revs you up for fight or flight, and that parasympathetic nervous system calms you down and gets you back to a state of balance. The endocrine system controls the release of hormones, and hormones are chemical messengers that travel through your bloodstream. These are responsible for growth and development, metabolism, your emotions, your behaviors, as well as your immune system functioning. Now, if we look at Figure 12, the endocrine system and glands, I'll go over a few of these with you. You may recall the hypothalamus serves as kind of like a thermostat. It's trying to maintain a state of balance in the body, and we refer to that as homeostasis. And hypothalamus controls the levels of hormones throughout the body. The pituitary gland, which is controlled by the hypothalamus, is responsible for the development of bone, muscle, and cartilage. Our pineal gland is responsible for releasing melatonin, which controls sleep and wake cycles. And our thyroid gland controls our metabolism. The thymus is an organ located behind the breastbone, between your lungs and above your heart. And this releases white blood cells, commonly referred to as T cells or T lymphocytes, that aid the body's immune system functioning. Your adrenal glands, which are located on top of both of your kidneys, release epinephrine and cortisol, and those are necessary for everyday functioning, maintaining blood pressure and increasing blood flow to your muscles. The pancreas releases insulin and glucagon, which regulate glucose levels in the blood, and somatostatin, which prevents the release of insulin and glucagon. And finally, the testes and ovaries release a hormone known as testosterone, which aids in sexual desire and feelings of aggression. Let's dive into human development now and talk a little bit about life. When you think of human development, an important concept to understand is neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is the unique way that each person's brain develops and works. And much like a fingerprint, our brain is very unique to ourselves. No two brains are at all the same. And we don't have a definition of normal functioning in the human brain either. We have typical functioning, but there's no normal. So when we explore neurological differences, we can understand that they're the result of normal natural variation in the human genome that have evolved over time, and that these differences should not be considered deficits or deficiencies. What's also important to understand is that being neurodivergent is not something anyone can prevent, cure, or treat. Examples of some conditions neurodivergent individuals can have include ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, dyslexia, autism, Down syndrome, social anxiety, and Tourette's syndrome, among many others. Now, while neurodivergent individuals struggle in a neurotypical world much of the time, they have many strengths that set them apart, and once those strengths can be honed in on, these individuals can do quite well in a neurotypical environment that is inclusive of neurodivergent individuals. So this diagram here shows the strengths individuals have with autism and ADHD, and shared strengths between the two neurodivergent conditions. So for autism, individuals have an incredible ability to concentrate. They're great with logic and sequencing. They're great observers, and they have good attention to detail. For ADHD, they have great intuition, humor, passion, curiosity, and a spark for adventure. In between the two neurodivergent conditions, the shared strengths are creativity, determination, innovation, honesty, and resilience. So again, there's many strengths that being a neurodivergent individual, but there's also many challenges and barriers these individuals have to overcome. So by being more inclusive of neurodivergent individuals and creating a more supportive environment so that these individuals can excel, will create more equity across the workplace. So what is human development? Human development is defined as the process of physical, cognitive, and emotional change and growth from the start of life to the very end of it. And researchers explore human development by looking at the nature-nurture debate, where we try to see how much of an individual is because of their genes, their genetic makeup, what is biological, and how much of that individual is because of their experiences, their environment, and what they've grown to learn. Human reproduction is the very first step towards human development. And each human being has gametes, which are sex cells, that carry their DNA. So males have sperm or semen, and females have oocytes or eggs. And when the sperm and the oocytes or the eggs join, we have fertilization that occurs. And on the sperm and on the egg, we have our genetic makeup, our DNA. And the sperm contributes 23 chromosomes, and the egg contributes another 23 chromosomes, so that the offspring will have a total of 46 chromosomes. Now, when fertilization occurs by the union of the egg and the sperm, we have what is called a zygote. And this is what a zygote looks like under magnification. A zygote has quite a long journey to take in order to make its way into the uterus. We call this period the germinal period, which takes roughly a week and a half for that zygote to make its way down the fallopian tube and find its way into the uterus. Now, once there, the zygote may attach itself to the uterine wall, and this is known as implantation. And once implantation occurs, you have a pregnancy. And you enter into now the embryonic stage of development, where that developing zygote is now becoming an embryo, forming a gestational sac, a yolk sac, and all of the vital organs necessary for survival, such as the brain and the heart. When a pregnancy occurs, right, the hormones in the female body will change in order to support that pregnancy. And the first hormone that gets measured for is known as HCG. You can measure that on a home pregnancy test, or a doctor can order a blood test for that. Now, when a pregnancy occurs, the doctors will inform the female about proper nutrition, going on a prenatal vitamin, and avoiding toxins in their environment. And we call toxins teratogens, as you've seen in your course web text. So it's important to also abstain from strenuous activities during this time in order to support the development of the fetus. So from 9 weeks after fertilization until birth, the developing offspring, right, is known as a fetus inside of the female. And it's important, right, to understand that at any point during embryonic development or fetal development, that miscarriage is always a risk. Miscarriage typically happens more frequently up into the 13th week from fertilization. And it declines as you get farther and farther into your pregnancy. So the farther you go, the less of a risk you have for a miscarriage as you carry the embryo or the fetus. We call the age of viability the point at which a fetus can survive if born prematurely, and that's around 22 weeks. But that doesn't mean that it will survive at that point. That's a very risky situation that may or may not turn out successful with a successful live birth. Now, with a newborn or a neonate, we look at the reflexes as an indication of healthy brain and nervous system development. And so doctors and nurses will do a whole battery of tests where they're looking at how well the newborn is sucking, blinking, grasping, swallowing, and doing all other sorts of reflexes in order to gauge whether the newborn is developing typically. An important aspect of cognitive and emotional development is the attachment that forms between the caregiver and child. And the attachment style itself can influence the quality of the overall relationship between the caregiver and child. So when we're looking at attachment, it's defined as the positive emotional bond that develops between a child and a particular individual, usually a caregiver. And research has shown, Harlow's research with monkeys in particular, that contact comfort is a necessity for a secure form of attachment. So in the research, the monkeys preferred contact comfort over food, which demonstrated that touch is incredibly important when forming an attachment. Another experiment focused on exploring the type of attachment between the caregiver and child. And this was conducted by Mary Ainsworth, and it was called The Strange Situation. She would have the caregiver bring the child into a room. There would be another adult in that room, and she would ask the caregiver to leave. And they would record what would happen with how the child would behave while the caregiver was away. Then they reunited the caregiver with the child and recorded and documented how that child behaved. And they found that children with high levels of trust in their caregiver had more of a distressing experience when the caregiver left the room. And they were more eager to reach out and reunite with that caregiver once they entered the room. And those with insecure attachment styles lacked in trust with their caregiver. So they didn't believe that the caregiver would come back. And when the caregiver did come back into the room, they avoided them. They didn't want to reunite. Maybe they ignored them and played with the other adult that was still in the room. And researchers now are exploring these types of secure attachment and insecure attachment in adulthood, how they carry over from childhood into adulthood, and they had found that those who had secure attachments during childhood have healthier, more well-adjusted lives during adulthood, in which they have healthier relationships, more secure attachments with friends and partners, and they also are avoidant of drugs and alcohol use. It's important to also share that while the research mentions there are no gender differences as it pertains to attachments between caregivers and child, there are gender differences as it relates or pertains to caregiving itself, where males are typically more physical with the child and rough and tumble in how they play. For example, throwing the child in the air and catching them or spinning them around. And females are take a more delicate approach and are more verbal with the child, perhaps reading to that child more or talking to that child versus being more physical. Many parents and caregivers will invest in child care outside of the home. And when doing so, it's important that parents and caregivers research the quality of the programs that they're investing in. Because you want your child to have an environment that's healthy, so that they're going to be healthy in physically and psychologically, so that they have high quality caregivers at at the child care facility, number one. But that while they're there, they're learning new things. They have enough activities going on that stimulate the children, so that the children are constantly in a state of learning. But it's also important that there's other children there and that it's a social environment, so that child is getting an education and forming friendships outside of their bond with the caregiver. On this slide, we're going to go over 4 parenting styles. However, it's important to mention that outside of uninvolved parenting, there really is no parenting style that is better than the next. Parenting styles have to factor in one's culture, one's environment, and the temperament of the child. You can be a parent of 3 children and have different parenting styles for each of those children. You parent them differently based on who they are, based on their temperament, and how they respond to obedience. So, with that said, authoritarians are rigid, punitive, they demand obedience and require a lot from their children. And research shows that children from disadvantaged homes who grow up in extreme poverty and in poor neighborhoods tend to do quite well with this style of parenting. So it's not a bad thing. It's not a bad style to practice, if that's something that your culture and your environment kind of require. You require more discipline in that environment. You have to be more strict in order to have that child focused, perhaps academically. Permissive parenting is a relaxed or inconsistent parenting style that requires little from their children. And permissive parents tend to let their children get away with more disobedience. They turn a blind eye, so to speak. But not being consistent in rules can be a bad thing over time, because it will be hard to get that child to obey you when you truly, really need them to follow direction. Authoritative parenting, they set limits, use reasoning, explain things, and encourage independence. And authoritative parenting has been shown to be quite beneficial because it's correlated with secure attachment. So you're building a lot of trust when you're explaining things and using reasoning and encouraging that child to be independent. You're less punitive, you're less rigid and demanding on that child. And for example, if the child does something wrong, you sit down and explain to that child what they did wrong, so that they learn from that experience and can grow. That's a way of developing trust, because should you just punish that child without them understanding anything, perhaps in an authoritarian way, that child's going to continue making the same mistake without truly ever learning from it. In uninvolved parenting, they show little interest, are emotionally detached. They believe parenting is only providing food, clothing, and shelter, the basic necessities. Uninvolved parents or caregivers may or may not be present in the child's life, right? They may be living somewhere else while another caregiver is taking care of that child, and they just give money for food, clothing, and shelter, or they, provide those necessities directly to that child. Now, no theory of cognitive development has had more of an impact than Piaget's theory of cognitive development, in which he believed that children progress over these 4 stages of kind of cognitive growth spurts in a fixed order. And you first start out life, birth through age 2, in the sensory motor stage. Your understanding comes from touching, sucking, chewing, manipulating objects. And around 9 months, you develop object permanence, the awareness that objects and people continue to exist even if they are out of sight. So the game of peekaboo, right? You still understand that person is right in front of you, even though you can't see them. Then from age 2 to 7, you enter into the pre-operational stage, where development of language and use of symbols happens. You still use egocentric thought, and you view the world entirely from his or her own perspective. So egocentric thinking is quite common in young children. For example, if someone believes that red kites are the coolest thing ever, if a little child believes that, he'll believe that you believe that too, that everybody believes that red kites are the best thing ever. Then you enter into the concrete operational stage from ages 7 to 12. Logical thought develops, and you start understanding the concepts of conservation. So you understand amount, volume, and length of an object doesn't change when its shape changes. And here, to test for this, they'll pour the same volume of water into different shaped glasses and test whether that child can understand that the laws of conservation. And the last stage is known as the formal operational stage, which occurs from 12 through adulthood. Abstract, formal, logical thought develops here. Now, Vygotsky's view on cognitive development is that the children are influenced by their environment. So they're taught by the people and culture that surround them. And he developed this idea of the zone of proximal development, which is the level at which a child can almost, but not fully, comprehend or perform a task on his or her own. If information falls within the ZPD, children can master it. So here's an example, we get into that slide, of practicing baking cookies, for example. If you just give all of the tools, the entire recipe, you have all of the pieces to the recipe, you say to a young child, okay, bake me some cookies. The learner can't do it because they're out here. They're not in the zone of proximal development. Now, the caregiver goes ahead and helps that child put the recipe together, make the cookies, shows them how to form the cookie and put the cookie on the sheet. They're in a zone of proximal development. They can do it with guidance. And after they're taught how to bake cookies, they can do it by themselves eventually. So again, the learner has to have a teacher or someone that guides them through each of the steps in order for them to do the task unaided. So the most prominent physical changes occur during adolescence when you enter puberty. And puberty is the period at which maturation of the sexual organs occurs, beginning at about age 11 or 12 for girls with the start of menstruation, and 13 or 14 for boys with sperm march, the first ejaculation. And those are just the beginnings. It's kind of like the average for when onset of puberty happens, but it can be much earlier, it can be much later. A lot has to do with one's genetics, as well as their physical health, whether they're obese, and their environment. So maybe they're in an environment that has certain chemicals that will influence the onset of puberty. In this table, I'm presenting Erik Erikson's 8 stages of psychosocial development. And he theorized that at each stage, an individual is experiencing a psychosocial crisis that could positively or negatively affect personality development. And successfully resolving the conflicts, he argued, leads to virtues like hope, will, purpose, and integrity. And failure leads to outcomes such as mistrust, guilt, role confusion, and despair. So when we're in adolescence, the most important thing to an adolescent, according to Erik Erikson, is to achieve a sense of identity, to understand, who am I, and what do I like to do, and what am I all about, right? So you're in a psychosocial stage, psychosocial crisis of identity versus role confusion. And a positive outcome of understanding your personal identity is you develop an awareness of uniqueness of self and knowledge of role to be followed. You know who you are. You understand you're different. And a negative outcome is this inability to identify appropriate roles in life. You don't really know who you are, and you have trouble fitting in and feeling comfortable around other people. And maybe rather than being yourself, you tend to conform a little bit more. Some alarming statistics related to suicide in adolescence show that suicide is the second leading cause of death for people ages 10 to 14, as well as ages 25 to 34. So we're seeing young people committing suicide at higher rates. And we know that males are more likely to commit suicide than females, but females will attempt suicide more often. And this is typically due to the way an individual decides to commit suicide, with males typically selecting more aggressive ways than females. Then we know that the rate is higher among whites than non-whites. And some causes to suicide are related to depression, social anxiety, family background, adjustment difficulties, parental conflict, alcohol and drug abuse, as well as the amount of times an individual attempts suicide. So a suicide attempt can indicate that a suicide is more likely to happen in the future. The peak of health occurs during early adulthood, between the ages of 18 to 25. And during these years, most individuals are at their strongest, their healthiest, and their reproductive capabilities are at their highest levels. We see changes in reproductive capabilities as men and women enter into middle adulthood, specifically women. Women in their late 40s or early 50s enter into menopause, which is a period during which women stop menstruating and are no longer fertile. Men, on the other hand, don't experience menopause and can be fertile long and through late adulthood. Generally speaking, individuals in early adulthood and middle adulthood are looking to create social connections that are meaningful. And they're looking to create a life that has purpose. And individuals will find purpose in a variety of things. They can find purpose in their family, purpose in their friendships, in their careers, in their talents, right, their hobbies, and also in how they contribute to their communities. So as we're all working at life, time doesn't stop. We're consistently getting older each and every year. And what's upsetting about our culture, American culture, is that we don't embrace old age. We don't embrace the aging process in and of itself. In our culture, for example, we have thousands of products cosmetics and services that are geared to help make you look younger, feel younger, and in doing so, we're told that that's going to make us happier, right? Being young makes you happy. So it's all about mindset and how we understand and how we view the aging process, which will determine how we experience the aging process. And entering into midlife, many people will have an experience where they go through a transition, where they're questioning their lives and their accomplishments, and they make major moves at this point in life. Like maybe they go into a different career, or maybe they invest in things that they hadn't before that make them happier, like travel or objects and things like that candy apple red sports car. And you question your life, and you know that you're getting older and there's not much time left to live, so why not live now in the moment type of mentality. And that's good, as long as you keep perspective with your values and your future long-term goals in mind. You wouldn't want to go out and spend money on that sports car if you didn't have the money to spend on that sports car, because then that would cause you to go into debt and all of these other things, and your long-term goals might not work out financially for you. So it's all about mindset. Mindset truly matters as in life, with anything, but especially with aging and how you approach your life. So there's some interesting facts about marriage, children, and divorce. And the average age of marriage is higher, with more cohabitation before marriage. About half of all first marriages end in divorce. And they found that almost 75% of married women with school-aged children are employed outside of the home. So this is showing that as society has changed and evolved over time, so has concepts and ideas of marriage, children, and divorce. And it's a given that these facts will change even more in the future, right? So as our society changes, our beliefs and ideas and the social norms and what society deems as acceptable versus not acceptable changes. A specialty that studies older adults and aging is known as gerontology. Gerontologists see individuals typically around the age of 65 or older, and they are important doctors who understand the aging process and can help with facilitating certain things as an individual gets older based on their needs. So if they need more care in the home, a gerontologist would be able to provide them with that type of care and get them the resources that they need so that they can still live independent lives. So as you enter into late adulthood, you see more changes in appearance and more physical changes in your body. There's some theories as to why this happens. There's a genetic pre-programming theory of aging, which shares that human cells have a built-in time limit to their reproduction. And after a certain time, they're no longer able to divide. There's also a wear and tear theory of aging, so that mechanical functions of the body stop working efficiently as you age. So just like an old car, if you don't oil it up and it gets old, over time the body is the same way. The body will break down and not work as efficiently. So we see hair thinning, hair turning gray. We see wrinkling of the skin, folding of the skin. And sometimes we see a slight loss of height due to our shrinkage in our spine. But we also have issues with our senses. So we see a decrease in vision, hearing, smell, and taste, all of which all become less sensitive. Our reaction time slow, and also physical stamina changes. We're not able to keep up physically like we used to. Now, some cognitive changes in late adulthood consist of a decline in fluid intelligence, which is information processing skills such as memory, calculations, and analogy solving. And memory loss is not inevitable with aging. It's kind of like the more you use it, the better it is. So the more you're using your brain, remaining active with critical thinking activities, maybe solving puzzles, playing Scrabble, reading books, and crafting even, can help with keeping your brain active so that you don't experience memory loss. We see a lot of individuals in late adulthood have dementia or Alzheimer's disease. And this is due to plaques that develop in your brain that inhibit you from recalling memories or forming new memories as well. Entering into late adulthood may present some significant challenges. For example, should one enter into retirement, they may lose the social connections that they had while at work or in their professional network. They may also experience changes to their income and changes to their health. And they may find themselves caring for a significant other who needs more support. So with all of those challenges and changes in life, it's important to remember that this period of development is still a time for continued growth and development. That while there's so many changes and while you are now considered old, it doesn't mean that you're going to lose your memory. It doesn't mean that you're going to be a lonely person. There's opportunities, and it's important for individuals, again, to have that focused forward mindset in order to see those opportunities and take advantage of them. Remaining active during old age or maintaining the interests and activities you had during middle age will help you get through late adulthood and help you stay active and social rather than disengaging. So it's important that while old age might be seen as a bad thing, that we have that mentality and that mindset that keeps us growing. Death is a part of life, and throughout life we experience death of loved ones and friends, and as we age, we just have more and more experience with death. Ultimately, until we come to terms with our own impending death, right? So we start thinking of our life and how we're going to be dealing with the process of dying. And there's 5 stages of dealing with death. And the first is denial. You're going to resist the idea that you're dying. Anger. You get upset at the people who are in good health and good spirits around you. You get upset at the God that you worship. You get upset at the medical professionals who might be diagnosing you with a terminal illness. So you get jealous and angry at those around you and at your faith. Bargaining happens where you try to postpone death. People might bargain with God, saying that if you give me another year, I'll do this. Depression sets in when bargaining doesn't work, and then you accept death, which is the final stage. You make peace with yourself. In the life that you've lived. So adjusting to death is never easy, especially if you're facing a terminal illness and you've been given a set time to live. But those are the stages of grief, and those are also the stages of dealing with death. So thank you for reviewing the lecture. Should you have any questions, please post your questions to the General Question Discussion Forum, and have a great day.